"Stop! We don't have time," Emily commanded, pushing Caleb toward a loveless marriage while her heart shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. The Duke of Thornfield has lived for duty, but standing before the king, he finally understands that an authentic soul is worth more than a hollow crown. He has abandoned his legacy to find the woman who lied to save him. But what if she's already gone? The Duke of Thornfield spent his life forging an empire of iron and measured precision, pledging his soul to an unyielding legacy, until her smile brought him to his knees. A single glance from Emily Haraway, a woman with no fortune, no title, and only the light of a morning garden, threatened to melt his armored resolve. Now, standing on the precipice of a crown-mandated future, Caleb Winslow must make a choice that defies 2 centuries of ancestry. Will he remain a prisoner to his father's hollow promise? Or will he risk total ruin for the only mercy he has ever craved? The deeper he falls, the more the trap of high society treason closes around him. Is it already too late for the man who refused to show weakness? Hello, lovely. If you are captivated by this tale of duty versus passion, I would be so grateful if you would like or subscribe. It allows me to bring you more stories of forbidden longing and historical heart-pounding romance. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? I read every note. The scratch of quill on parchment was the only sound in the Duke of Thornfield's private study, save for the relentless tick of the mantel clock, marking the passage of another hollow evening. Caleb Winslow, known to the world as the Duke of Thornfield, sat alone at his mahogany desk, long after the corridors of Whitehall Palace had emptied of ministers and clerks. The weight of high-stakes trade negotiations spread before him like a battle map. A single oil lamp burned, casting shadows that danced across walls lined with leather-bound volumes and framed maps of territories he had helped secure for the crown. The marble fireplace stood cold and dark. Caleb never bothered to light it, even on chill evenings, as comfort seemed an indulgence when duty demanded his absolute attention. His eyes drifted from the French textile agreement to the portrait hanging above the fireplace. His father, the late Duke, stared down with a stern expression that Caleb had learned to mirror perfectly. Those painted eyes seemed to follow him, judge him, and remind him of the price of his station. 34 years, Caleb thought, setting down his quill. 14 of them in service to the crown. He looked around at the evidence of his achievements and wondered what he had to show for it beyond a title, a legacy, and an empty house. The memory arrived unbidden in the solitary hour, taking him back to his father's bedchamber, heavy with the smell of illness. He could still feel the old Duke's hand gripping his with surprising strength as he issued a weak but unyielding command. His father had reminded him that the Ravenswood name had served the crown for 2 centuries, and that duty must exist above comfort and desire. "I promise," Caleb had whispered, feeling the weight of generations settling on his shoulders. His father had pushed for more, forcing Caleb to recite the creed that the crown was all that mattered. The promise had become Caleb's compass, his measuring stick, and his prison. The sound of footsteps on marble broke through his reverie, and though he did not look up, he knew the confident stride. Lord Geoffrey Wickliffe entered without knocking, carrying a bottle of brandy and 2 glasses, noting that Caleb was working late again. Geoffrey reminded him that the trade negotiations would not vanish if he slept occasionally. He studied his friend with genuine concern, despite the fact that Caleb's trade proposal had just passed through Parliament. Caleb accepted the brandy, allowing himself a rare moment of satisfaction as they discussed the jealousy of Lord Petton, who had voted against the proposal naturally. Geoffrey warned that ambitious men like Petton were never harmless when they felt overlooked, but Caleb dismissed the concern, stating his position serving the king was secure. Geoffrey leaned forward, asking if it was duty or mere exhaustion that made Caleb so careless with his own well-being. He challenged Caleb to remember the last time he had done anything that wasn't in service to the crown, noting that discussing agricultural subsidies with ambassadors did not count as a social life. When Caleb asked if there was more to life than duty, The question came out more bitter than intended. Jeffrey shifted to a more serious tone, revealing he had come about Caleb's mother's charitable trust. He identified a family in Bath requiring assistance, the Harroways. Caleb felt a flash of irritation, suggesting that his manager Curthers should handle the trust accounts. However, Jeffrey insisted that protocol required Caleb to personally assess their circumstances, reminding him of his mother's wish that he manage the trust personally to see the people rather than just their paperwork. Caleb's jaw tightened as he thought of the French ambassador arriving Friday and the Austrian delegation the following week. Jeffrey's voice was gentle but firm as he pointed out that Caleb's mother established the trust because she knew Caleb would become this, a man of all duty and no humanity. The words stung because they were true, and Caleb reached for the folder, allotting exactly 3 days for the task. Jeffrey stood with relief, noting that the Harroways were expecting him Thursday afternoon and that accommodation in Bath had already been arranged. After Jeffrey left, Caleb opened the Harroway file with mechanical efficiency. His eyes scanned the details. The father was deceased, leaving behind significant gambling debts. The estate was in ruin, assets seized, and the widow, Mrs. Harroway, was in poor health. The burden had fallen to the daughter, Emily Harroway, aged 22, who was managing household affairs and trying to keep her younger brothers in school. Caleb noted that tuition was maintained through Emily's personal efforts, and the application for trust assistance was submitted with a detailed repayment proposal. Emily had requested no charity, only temporary assistance with clear terms for gradual reimbursement. This was unusual to Caleb. Most beneficiaries approached the trust with desperate pleas, but Emily had submitted what amounted to a business proposal. He set the page aside, intending to return to his treatise, but his eyes caught a single line in the property assessment. It mentioned that the Harroway garden was maintained personally by Emily Harroway, who had dismissed the groundskeeper to reduce expenses. She tended the roses daily in memorial to her late father. Something about that detail lodged in Caleb's mind, the image of a woman of the gentry doing manual labor to preserve a memory. It seemed both foolish and touching to him, a triumph of sentiment over practicality. He shook his head, reminding himself that sentiment was irrelevant to his task. He would assess their needs, allocate funds, and return to work that actually mattered. He closed the file and turned back to his documents, but the words blurred. The oil lamp flickered as he looked around his sanctuary and prison, dominated by maps of Europe and his father's watchful portrait. He wondered what he truly had: a title inherited, not earned, and respect born of fear. No wife, no warmth, only duty. He picked up the Harroway file once more and whispered to the empty room that he would spend 3 days in Bath, then return to what mattered. Standing by the window, he looked out at the fog rolling through London and pressed his palm against the glass, telling himself that purpose and duty were enough. He extinguished the lamp, leaving the study for the empty townhouse, carrying the weight of the crown like a man who had forgotten how to stand up straight. The ducal carriage rolled through Bath's elegant streets as morning sunlight gilded the honey-colored stone buildings that gave the city its distinctive, ancient glow. Caleb Winslow, the Duke of Thornfield, watched through the window with a detached eye, passing the Roman baths and catching the faint, sulphurous scent of the waters that had drawn the fashionable and the infirm for centuries. His carriage, a gleaming black lacquer bearing the Ravenswood crest in gold, seemed almost vulgar against the city's genteel modesty. Where London was defined by grandeur and raw power, Bath maintained a quieter dignity, a faded elegance that clung stubbornly to a former glory he found both admirable and wearying. They turned off the fashionable Royal Crescent, navigating narrow streets until the horses stopped before a townhouse on a respectable but clearly declining row. Caleb studied the structure with the practiced eye of a man accustomed to assessing value. The address remained proper, but the building showed unmistakable signs of financial strain. Paint peeling from the window frames, one shutter hanging slightly askew, and iron hinges touched with the orange bloom of rust. Yet, despite the decay, evidence of effort remained. Window boxes overflowed with bright geraniums and trailing ivy. The front steps were scrubbed to a brilliant white, and the brass door knocker, though aged, gleamed from recent polishing. It was pride maintaining dignity in the face of poverty, a quality Caleb recognized from his mother's final illness. He straightened his coat, adjusted his cravat, and assumed the neutral bearing expected of a duke. Shoulders back, expression impassive, every inch the aristocrat ready to assess a supplicant. When the carriage door opened, he was met by Davies, a butler whose livery was spotless but frayed at the cuffs, buttons polished to brilliance but obviously old. Caleb noted the man's shoes were worn thin at the soles, another silent testament to dignity preserved through sheer determination. Informed that he was earlier than expected, Caleb replied with his characteristic impatience, stating he preferred to manage his schedule efficiently. Caleb was led into a small morning room filled with faded wallpaper and furniture that had been quality 30 years ago but now showed the sheen of long use. Fresh roses sat in a chipped porcelain vase, their fragrance cutting through the musty scent of the old house. Left alone to wait for Lady Westbrook, Caleb found himself drawn to the window overlooking the back garden, and the sight stopped him completely. Where the house showed the scars of neglect, the garden was extraordinary. Roses bloomed in a riot of color, pink, white, deep crimson, and pale yellow, their beds meticulously maintained. Gravel paths were raked as smooth as a formal palace garden, and lavender bordered the walkways with precise symmetry. This was not the garden of someone merely making do. It was the work of someone who understood beauty and refused to let it die regardless of the personal cost. There, among the roses, was a young woman. She wore a simple morning dress of gray muslin, practical rather than fashionable, with her sleeves rolled to her elbows in a total defiance of propriety. She wore no gloves to protect her hands, and her chestnut hair was pinned up loosely, with tendrils escaping around her face to suggest she had been working for some time. She was absorbed in the task of pruning, examining each stem with careful attention before making a cut. Caleb watched, telling himself he was merely observing a beneficiary, yet he could not deny her movements were filled with a graceful, natural efficiency. She paused before a bloom that was just beginning to open, and a smile spread across her face. Not the practiced, polite smile Caleb saw in London ballrooms, but something genuine and unguarded. It was as if sunlight had suddenly broken through the clouds. Caleb felt something shift in his chest, a tightening or perhaps a loosening he could not identify. He heard her voice through the open window, soft as she spoke to the flower. "There you are. I knew you'd bloom if I was patient." A bold robin landed nearby, hopping close to her as she worked, and the woman laughed. It was a warm, unguarded sound that seemed to belong to the earth and the garden itself. Caleb realized he was staring, a vulnerability he had trained himself to avoid for decades. He could not look away as she turned toward the house, sensing his observation, and their eyes met through the glass. Her eyes were hazel, direct, and intelligent, showing none of the calculated coyness he expected from the ton. Her smile faltered in surprise, yet she did not curtsy. She offered a small, questioning smile and a slight nod, a simple acknowledgement of his presence. Before he could think better of it, Caleb found himself nodding back. The moment shattered when Davies returned to announce that Lady Westbrook would receive him, and that Lady Amelia, Emily Harroway, was coming in from the garden. Caleb turned from the window, composing his features into their usual stone-like neutrality. But the sound of her laugh still echoed in the quiet room. When the door opened, Emily entered in a rush, slightly breathless as she tried to make herself presentable. She had removed her apron and smoothed her hair, but a smudge of soil remained on her wrist. Her curtsy was proper but not obsequious as she apologized for the early arrival and her dirty-handed state. She held up her hands with a disarming honesty that made the soil under her fingernails seem like a mark of honor. Caleb, caught in an unfamiliar current, remarked that the roses were beautiful. Her face lit up with a pleasure that was unmistakable. "Thank you, Your Grace. It was Papa's greatest joy. I couldn't let it go to ruin." Formal introductions followed as Mrs. Westbrook entered, frail and leaning on a walking stick. Caleb launched into his prepared business speech, outlining the trust provisions, funding, and repayment schedules with a detached efficiency he had used 1,000 times. He expected the mother's effusive gratitude, which came predictably, but he was surprised when Emily interrupted gently to ask about the specific terms. She leaned forward, her expression serious as she asked about the repayment expectations, oversight, and conditions of the funding. Caleb found himself actually engaged rather than merely performing a duty. Most beneficiaries accepted charity with a plea, but this woman was treating the arrangement like a professional business transaction. He challenged her, noting that she seemed concerned about accepting assistance. Emily met his eyes steadily. "Not concerns, Your Grace. I simply believe in understanding obligations completely. We are accepting assistance, not charity. There is a significant difference." She added matter-of-factly that charity demeans the recipient, while fair assistance with clear terms preserves self-respect. Caleb found himself explaining more than was necessary, dictate giving way to discussion. When he mentioned the schooling of her brothers as a commendable priority, her expression softened once more, stating the boys deserved their chance despite their father's mistakes. As the meeting concluded, Caleb felt a reluctance to leave that was as sharp as it was unusual. At the door, he mentioned her father's garden again, stating the man had excellent taste in roses. The genuine, transformative smile he had seen through the window returned as she quoted her father. "Roses require patience and faith. Your Grace, you must tend them carefully, even when they're not blooming, trusting that beauty will come." Their eyes held for a moment, and Caleb saw a quiet strength in her that birth or fortune could never grant. He left the house with the sun warm on his shoulders, but his thoughts remained in the garden. That night in London, surrounded by trade treaties and maps, Caleb found himself picturing her under the stars, tending those roses with that same patient faith. It was a foolish, sentimental thought, entirely irrelevant to the service of the crown. He checked his compositions, looking for the man of measured precision his father had demanded he be. But standing in his cold sanctuary, the memory of her laugh cut through the tick of the mantel clock, leaving the Duke of Thornfield wondering if the iron resolution of his life was as secure as he had believed. The heavy, silver-weighted silence of the room was broken only by the methodical scratch of Caleb's pen as he annotated the final clauses of the Haraway Trust dispersal. He sat with his spine a rigid pillar against the high-backed mahogany chair, the very image of the Duke of Thornfield, a man of measured precision who existed as a vessel for the crown's stability. Across from him, the morning room of the Haraway house felt smaller than it had during his first visit, perhaps because the air seemed charged with an invisible current. Mrs. Haraway sat quietly, a fragile spectator to the proceedings, but it was Emily who commanded the space between them. She had replaced her gardening muslin with a dress of modest blue, yet a phantom scent of damp earth and lavender seemed to cling to her, an alluring defiance against the sterile atmosphere of financial documentation. Caleb cleared his throat, his voice maintaining the flat, professional cadence that had served him for 14 years of ministerial duty. He explained that the initial disbursement would cover the immediate gambling debts left by her late father, effectively clearing the seize orders on the estate assets. He referred to the act as an essential mercy of the trust, a phrasing he had used 1,000 times to denote the benevolent reach of his mother's charity. He expected the usual response, the downcast eyes, the murmured gratitude, the submissive acceptance of a benefactor's grace. Instead, Emily leaned forward, her hazel eyes direct and startlingly clear under the amber glow of the morning sun. She challenged him then, not with anger, but with a terrifyingly calm intellect that stopped his breath. She noted that he called it charity, yet the terms he had written required a 5% interest repayment structured over the next 10 years. She argued that charity was a gift intended to alleviate the giver's conscience, often leaving the recipient hollowed out by a debt of gratitude they could never repay. She preferred to view the arrangement as professional assistance, a partnership where the Haraway name provided the labor and the eventual return on investment, while the trust provided the bridge. To her, the distinction was not academic. It was the difference between being a ward of the state and a mistress of her own dignity. Caleb paused, his pen hovering above the parchment. He had dealt with ministers, ambassadors, and monarchs, yet he found himself suddenly wrong-footed by a 22-year-old commoner who tended roses with her bare hands. He watched the way her fingers traced the edge of the repayment schedule, noting the smudge of soil still faint beneath her left thumbnail, a mark of her toil that he found suddenly, inexplicably alluring. It was a physical manifestation of her soul, a soul that refused to be managed or categorized by his bureaucratic precision. He defended his wording, stating that from a legal standpoint, the Crown viewed such uncollateralized loans as charitable acts. Emily didn't blink. She countered that the legal standpoint was merely a mask for a lack of genuine human regard. She suggested that he was afraid of the word partnership, because it implied an equality of spirit that his title could not permit. She spoke of the roses again, how they were not objects of charity from the sun, but participants in a cycle of mutual effort. Caleb felt a heat rise to his face that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. He realized he was no longer talking about money or documents. He was engaging in a duel of philosophy with a woman who saw through the Duke of Thornfield and straight into Caleb Winslow. The meeting stretched longer than his internal mantle clock usually allowed. He found himself explaining the intricacies of the textile agreements and why the Crown was so hesitant to move on interest rates, matters he had never shared with a beneficiary before. He was mesmerized by the sharp, analytical edge of her mind, the way she could dissect a financial clause with the same focused grace she used to prune a rosebush. The more she pushed back against his rigid distinctions, the more he felt the iron armor around his heart begin to fissure. She was dangerous because she was honest, and in her presence, his carefully maintained neutrality felt like a threadbare lie. Mrs. Haraway eventually spoke, sensing the shift in the room, but Caleb hardly heard her. His focus was entirely on Emily, the way her gentle optimism was tempered by a steely resilience, the way she smiled when she caught a discrepancy in his math. He caught himself thinking that he had never met anyone so alive, someone who existed so fully within their own skin. As he finally gathered his papers to leave, their hands accidentally brushed across the table. The contact was electric, a sharp jolt of connection that made Caleb's measured precision vanish in an instant. He didn't pull away immediately. For a heartbeat longer than propriety permitted, he looked into her eyes and saw a reflection of a man he had forgotten existed. A man who was allowed to want something beyond duty. Emily breathed in sharply, her composure wavering for the first time, her hands trembling as she pulled them back to wring them nervously. The silence that followed was heavy, no longer formal but profoundly personal. Caleb stood, his spine straightening by habit, yet he felt as though he were leaving behind a part of his soul in that dusty morning room. He walked to the door, his movements mechanical, yet his mind was a storm of hazel eyes and structured interest rates. At the threshold, he turned back to see her watching him, her expression a mix of gentle hope and direct challenge. He realized that the 3 days he had allotted for this task would be the hardest of his life. He was returning to London, to the French textile agreements and the watchful eyes of Lord Peton. But he knew the scratch of his quill would never sound the same. He had set out to honor his mother's legacy, but in meeting Emily Haraway, he had begun to question the legacy he was building for himself. The Duke of Thornfield was a man of all duty and no humanity, but as Caleb Winslow stepped out into the Bath sunlight, he finally felt the weight of his own heart. The silver-weighted silence of Caleb's London study felt heavier than usual upon his return, the mahogany walls closing in like the sides of a velvet-lined casket. He sat with his spine a rigid pillar, attempting to lose himself in the familiar scratch of quill on parchment, but the ink seemed to bleed into the shape of rose petals rather than the precise lines of trade agreements. The relentless tick of the mantel clock, once a comforting rhythm of efficiency, now mocked the passage of another hollow evening spent in the shadow of his father's portrait. Every time he closed his eyes, the sterile monochromatic world of Whitehall Palace was invaded by a phantom scent of damp earth and lavender, and the memory of hazel eyes that had seen directly through his ducal armor. He realized, with a mounting dread that mirrored the cold dark of his marble fireplace, that he was no longer a man of measured precision. The pressure in London arrived not with a shout, but with the quiet rustle of silk and the clinking of crystal at Lady Ashford's musicales. Lord Ashford, sensing a shift in the winds of political favor, had begun to coordinate the match between Caleb and his daughter Catherine with the relentless subtlety of a military campaign. Lady Catherine was a vision of porcelain perfection, her golden hair dressed in the latest fashion, and her blue eyes reflecting a gentility that spoke of centuries of breeding. She was, by every rational measure, the perfect duchess to sit beside the Iron Duke, yet Caleb found her technical, flawless pianoforte performance to be empty noise compared to the memory of an unguarded laugh in a Bath garden. During dinner, as he played his part with practiced ease, he caught himself drawing silent, traitorous comparisons. Where Catherine preferred flowers that were not troublesome, Emily had taught him that roses require patience and faith. This distraction, once an intellectual curiosity, was fast becoming a liability that high society's keenest predators began to scent. At the conference table at Whitehall, the French ambassador's voice seemed to come from a vast distance as Caleb stared at the light slanting through the windows, seeing not trade routes, but the way morning sun gilded a smudge of soil on a wrist. Even Geoffrey, his oldest confidant, raised an eyebrow as Caleb missed a critical point in the textile negotiations, noticing that the living corpse, who functioned only for the state, was finally showing cracks. The mask of the Duke was slipping, and Lord Peton, lurking in the corridors with barely concealed venom, watched the stumble with the eyes of a wolf waiting for a kill. By Wednesday's parliamentary session, the distraction had moved from the private to the performative. As Lord Peton droned on about agricultural subsidies, a topic Caleb should have countered with his usual surgical logic, he found his pen motionless on the page. The chamber had gone silent, and when he finally looked up, he met Peton's thin, mocking smile. Peton remarked on those who seemed distracted by matters beyond their station, a barb that hit home with terrifying accuracy. It was the first time Caleb felt the vulnerability he had trained himself to avoid, a tightening in his chest that told him duty was no longer his only compass. He was a man drowning in a masquerade of strength, realizing that his iron resolution was melting under the warmth of a smile he couldn't stop seeing in every darkened corner of the city. Late that night, alone in his study, Caleb confronted the truth he had tried to bury beneath heaps of trade treaties. He told himself his interest in Emily was merely intellectual respect, a refreshing change from the vapid society women whose conversations never ventured beyond the weather. Yet, as the clock struck midnight, he admitted he was lying to himself. It was everything more. The Crown demanded he marry Catherine at the upcoming royal ball to solidify his position, but his soul was miles away in a Bath garden, tending to things that weren't blooming yet. He was trapped between the legacy of centuries and a mercy he had only recently learned to crave, realizing that the weight of the crown was nothing compared to the weight of a heart that had finally woken up. The royal ball at St. James's Palace was London's social event of the season, and it showed in every excessive detail that Caleb usually navigated with mechanical indifference. Crystal chandeliers blazed with 1,000 candles, their light reflecting off the gold leaf that covered the ceiling in elaborate, suffocating patterns. An orchestra filled the gallery, their music weaving through the stilted conversations of hundreds of aristocrats dressed in their finest silks and satins. Caleb arrived in full ducal regalia, his formal coat bearing the Ravenswood crest in gold, a ceremonial sword at his hip, and rows of orders spanning his chest. He looked every inch the Duke, powerful, untouchable, and perfect, but inside, The heavy air of competing perfumes and glittering jewels felt as though it were slowly cutting off his air. He moved through the crowd as a man on a predetermined track, his spine a rigid pillar, ignoring the whispered speculations that followed his every step. Lord Geoffrey intercepted him near the entrance, his expression one of strained concern as he reminded Caleb that the king expected him to open the dancing with Lady Catherine. Caleb's voice remained steady as he accepted the command, but the invisible trap was closing. Lord Ashford was expecting an announcement of the engagement that very night. Before Caleb could settle into his stolid performance, the king himself emerged, pulling Caleb into a walk around the ballroom's perimeter. King William IV was elderly but sharp-eyed, and as they moved, he noted the shrewd match represented by Lady Catherine. However, the king saw the cracks Caleb had tried to hide, observing that a man who is thoughtful about marriage is often thinking about someone else. He warned Caleb that while duty had cost him his own happiness, Caleb should consider both legacy and the soul before making promises that could not be unmade. The warning had barely settled when the world Caleb had built began to tilt on its axis. He was engaged in a hollow diplomatic discussion about textile imports when Emily Haraway entered the ballroom on the arm of Lady Clara Blackwood. Caleb's carefully prepared remarks dissolved into meaningless noise as he stared at her, dressed in sapphire silk that contrasted with the simple, soil-stained image he had carried in his mind. She looked overwhelmed by the splendor, overwhelmed by the sea of elite eyes, yet she carried herself with a brave, natural grace. When Clara whispered something and Emily laughed, that genuine, unguarded sound Caleb had heard in the garden, he realized his diplomatic mask was gone. His eyes met Emily's, and for a long moment, the hundreds of watching nobles faded into a blur. The ballroom floor was a sea of calculated movement, but Caleb ignored the expectations of the ton as he moved toward her. Lady Catherine appeared at his elbow, her blue eyes reflecting a deep understanding of the vulnerability Caleb was displaying. She told him he was a terrible liar and urged him to go greet his guest, providing him with a permission that was also a final test of his choice. Caleb reached Emily, noting the visible tremble in her hands and the nervousness in her curtsy. Lady Clara, maneuvering shamelessly, suggested that protocol demanded Caleb dance with a new arrival, a dangerous transgression of the evening's order. Caleb did not decline. Instead, he asked Emily to honor him, and the shift in his chest became an undeniable force as his hand settled on her waist. As they began to waltz, the stilted propriety of London society vanished. Her hand in his felt as though it belonged there, warm and light, defying the weight of the decorations on his chest. They moved in silence until Caleb remarked on her beautiful dancing, prompting her to mention the lessons her father had insisted upon even when they were poor. Emily looked into his gray eyes and told him the truth, that his being there was a mistake and that everyone was staring. Caleb, seeing through every defense he had constructed, admitted that the moment felt more important than any affair of state. The world narrowed to the space between them as they locked eyes. Both admitted they could not stop thinking about their conversation in the garden. The confession was dangerous and irreversible, hanging in the air even as the music drew to an end. As Caleb bowed over her hand to resume propriety, the desperate need for authenticity overrode his decades of training. He whispered a request for her to meet him in the secluded corner of the palace rose garden, an invitation that was a betrayal of every duty he owed the crown. Emily hesitated, then gave the smallest, affirmative nod before moving back to Clara. Caleb forced himself back into the masquerade, dancing stiffly with Catherine and making mechanical pleasantries. But his heart pounded with a fear he had never known in battle or parliament. He waited for the appointed time, moving out onto the terrace where the jasmine bloomed and the night air felt cool against his heated skin. Emily emerged from the shadows 20 minutes later, wrapped in a shawl, her hazel eyes reflecting the moonlight and a terror of the consequences. She told him she shouldn't be there, that she heard the whispers about his impending engagement to Catherine. Caleb stepped closer, feeling the iron resolve of his father's legacy crumbling entirely. He told her that since Bath, he had thought of nothing but her smile and the way she saw through his defenses. He admitted that for 34 years he had lived only for the expectations of others, and it had brought him an empty life until she showed him what he was missing. When Emily warned that this choice would destroy his position and legacy, Caleb asked if duty was enough to live for. The silence that followed was profound and charged with a world-altering possibility. Caleb pulled her closer, their faces inches apart, and asked for the truth, if he was alone in this madness. Emily admitted she could not lie to him, and the kiss that followed was desperate, searching, and irreversible. They were shaking when they broke apart, the magnitude of what they had done settling over them like a shroud. Caleb whispered that without her, he had nothing worth keeping, a promise neither should have made in the shadows of a palace. They walked back toward the ballroom separately, trying to force themselves back into the roles of duke and commoner. Caleb didn't see the figures lurking in the deeper shadows of the terrace. Lord Peton had stepped back into a column, his eyes glittering with the satisfaction of a trap that had finally caught its prey. Beside him, Lord Hartley noted that the golden boy had finally handed them the shovel to dig his own grave. As Caleb returned to the terrace doors, Geoffrey was waiting, his expression grave and pale. He told Caleb that he had seen them, but more importantly, so had Peton. Geoffrey warned that the king's trust and Caleb's position meant nothing if he was destroyed by this indiscretion. But Caleb, blinded by feeling, stated he no longer cared. Geoffrey watched him with genuine alarm, reminding him that Emily would be destroyed along with him. The warning struck Caleb like a physical blow, yet as he looked through the glass at Emily standing with Clara, he knew the masquerade was truly over. The weight of the crown had been replaced by a weight of love that was far more dangerous, and the hunt had officially begun. The cool night air of the palace gardens offered a deceptive sense of sanctuary, a brief respite from the stifling grandeur of the ballroom where the scent of competing perfumes and the weight of 1,000 eyes had felt like a tightening noose. Caleb stood in the deepest shadows near the rose garden, his formal coat bearing the Ravenswood crest feeling heavier than ever before. The distant music of the orchestra drifted through the terrace doors, muted and dreamlike, yet it served as a persistent reminder of the world he was expected to uphold. He had performed his duty first, dancing stiffly with Lady Catherine under the shrewd, knowing gaze of the king, while his pulse hammered with a frantic rhythm that defied all decades of ducal training. He was a man accustomed to battle maps and high-stakes trade negotiations, yet waiting for Emily Haraway in the jasmine-scented dark made him feel like a raw recruit on the edge of a precipice. Footsteps on the gravel paths signaled her arrival, light and hesitant. Emily emerged from the shadows, wrapped in a borrowed shawl against the chill, her hazel eyes reflecting the silver moonlight and a profound, visible fear. She stopped several feet from him, the distance between them feeling like a chasm of class and propriety that neither was truly supposed to cross. She told him immediately that she should not be there, that the whispers in the ballroom had grown vicious, confirming his expected engagement to Catherine. Caleb watched her, noting the way her hands were clasped tightly together, and felt the iron armor he had worn since his father's deathbed finally begin to crumble. He told her that since he had first seen her in the Bath garden, he had been haunted by her smile and the way she possessed a faith in beauty that his cold life had never known. He stepped closer, invading the polite distance that society demanded. For 34 years, he confessed, his life had been a hollow succession of obligations, first to his father's ghost, then to the king and always to the Ravenswood name. He spoke of his townhouse in London as an empty sanctuary that felt more like a prison, and of his study where the ticking of the mantel clock only marked the passage of a soul-crushing void. Until the moment her unguarded laugh had shattered his neutral composure, he had believed that comfort was an indulgence and that a heart was a luxury he could not afford. He told her, with a voice that betrayed a decades-old suppression of feeling, that he had become a living corpse functioning only for the state. Emily looked up at him, tears forming in her hazel eyes as she whispered his title, as if to remind them both of the wall that separated a duke from a commoner. But Caleb corrected her, his voice low and desperate, rejecting the formality. He told her she was everything he had realized he was missing, the warmth that melted his armored resolve. She warned him that choosing her would destroy his position, ruin his family's legacy, and likely lead to social execution. Caleb looked into her eyes and asked if living only for the expectations of others was truly enough to sustain a man. He realized then that duty and purpose were no longer the same thing. Duty was obligation, but Emily was meaning. He reached for her, his gloved hand settling against her cheek with a reverence that felt like a sacrilege against his breeding. The touch was electric, a jolt of connection that made the palace behind them feel like a fragile, meaningless stage set. He asked her for the truth, for a single moment of honesty that the ballroom did not permit. He told her that if he was alone in this madness, he would walk away and marry Catherine as the perfect, hollow duke society expected him to be. But he begged her not to lie. Emily, her voice breaking with the weight of the confession, admitted she could not deny what she felt. The kiss was desperate, world-altering, and irreversible. In that moment, the Iron Duke was gone, replaced by a man who had finally standing up straight after carrying the weight of the crown for 14 hollow years. He found in her a mercy that trade treaties and crown favors could never provide. When they eventually broke apart, both were shaking with the realization of what they had set in motion. Emily whispered a question of what they had done, and Caleb admitted he did not know, but that without her, he had nothing worth keeping. They walked back toward the ballroom separately, trying to force their features back into the masks of duke and supplicant, but the jasmine-scented silence of the garden remained changed. Caleb had asked for mercy, and in the shadow of the palace roses, he had finally found the only thing worth more than his father's cold legacy. The atmosphere at Whitehall had shifted from the rigid efficiency of trade negotiations to a suffocating, silent judgment that Caleb Winslow could feel in his marrow the moment he crossed the threshold. The whispers followed him through the marble corridors like the hiss of a dying fuse, and junior ministers, who once bowed with practiced deference, now pressed themselves against the wood-paneled walls as though proximity to the Duke of Thornfield might contaminate their own careers. Geoffrey intercepted him before he reached the council chamber, his face a mask of pale anxiety that Caleb had never seen in all their years at Eton. Without a word, Geoffrey thrust a letter into his hand. Expensive paper bearing an anonymous mark, the seal already broken by the hands of men who had spent the morning deciding Caleb's fate. The words on the page were a surgical strike against Caleb's honor, a forged confession of treasonous intent that suggested the king's aging rule was an obstacle to England's true potential. The letter, signed in a perfect mimicry of Caleb's own precise hand, called for younger, more vigorous leadership, effectively painting Caleb as a usurper in the making. Horror dawned on him as he realized this was only one of many. Similar documents had been circulated among his closest allies, systematically poisoning his reputation over the course of 3 days. It was an expert frame, a sophisticated forgery that Caleb knew in his soul was the work of Lord Peton, weaponized at the very moment his heart had finally softened. The council chamber felt like a courtroom, with 30 of the king's closest advisers seated in a grim semicircle around the mahogany table. The king himself presided from the head of the board, his expression unreadable, while Lord Peton sat among the accusers, a glint of predatory satisfaction behind his eyes. The Lord Chancellor laid out the charges with a clinical coldness, accusing Caleb of harboring ambitions above his station and citing his frequent absences and recent distractions as evidence of a compromised judgment. Peton rose with a voice that dripped false concern, weaving Caleb's association with Emily Haraway into the narrative as proof that a penniless nobody had rendered the Duke unstable and reckless. Caleb's private life was no longer his concern, Peton argued, when the safety of the crown hung in the balance. Lord Ashford stood in an apoplectic fury, feeling personally insulted by the delay in the engagement to his daughter. He labeled Emily a distraction and a weakness, demanding that Caleb be held accountable for the shame brought upon the Ashford name. Even as Geoffrey attempted to defend the Duke, pointing out the discrepancies in the handwriting and the motive for forgery, the poison had already spread too far. Doubt had become a physical presence in the room, and Caleb stood alone before the throne as the council was adjourned, facing the king in a silence so profound he could hear the relentless tick of the mantel clock echoing his own pulse. "Are you a traitor, Edmund?" the king asked, his voice raw with the weight of decades of service. Caleb, dropping his guard for the first time in his public life, pledged his honor and his life to the crown. The king's eyes softened with a brief flash of sympathy, admitting that while he believed Caleb, the presence of the forged letters demanded a public demonstration of loyalty that words could not provide. Belief was not enough in the face of a rising parliamentary storm. Caleb had to prove his judgment was sound and his priorities were clear. The command that followed was an iron trap from which Caleb saw no escape. To protect his life, his title, and the Ravenswood legacy, Caleb was ordered to marry Lady Catherine Ashford within the fortnight and sever all connections with Emily Haraway immediately. The king made it clear. If Caleb refused, the accusations of treason would proceed, leading to ruin, the loss of his lands, or the gallows. Caleb felt the weight of 200 years of Ravenswood service crushing the air from his lungs, realizing that his attempt to standing up straight had only invited the crown to press him back down. As he left the palace, the fog of London felt like a shroud, and the mercy he had begged for in the garden seemed like a hallucination of a man who was already dead. 3 days after the parliamentary inquiry, Emily Haraway knelt in her garden, tending the roses that had become both her comfort and her torment. Every bloom reminded her of Caleb, of the surprise in his eyes when he first saw this sanctuary, and the way he had listened when she spoke of patience and faith. But the world beyond the gate had grown vicious. Clara Blackwood had arrived earlier that afternoon, clutching newspapers with headlines that screamed Caleb's name alongside accusations of treason and the announcement of his royal wedding to Lady Catherine. The articles branded Emily a nobody and a folly, suggesting her presence was evidence of Caleb's compromised judgment. Her mother, Mrs. Haraway, had wept as she spoke the truth Emily had tried to deny. If Emily truly cared for the Duke, she had to let him go so he could save himself from the gallows. Caleb arrived that evening, his horse lathered with exhaustion, his appearance disheveled and frantic. He pushed past the butler, entering the parlor with a manic plan to flee to Scotland, marry Emily by week's end, and disappear to the continent where he had converted his assets into portable wealth. He claimed that none of it mattered, not the title, the position, or the crown, only her. Emily listened as her heart broke, knowing that to accept his proposal would be to brand him a fugitive and a traitor forever, closing every door in Europe to the man he was born to be. She had practiced the words in her mirror until they came like cold iron, forcing a resolve that nearly shattered her. She looked at him and delivered the blow intended to set him free. She told him that his proposal was declined, forcing a glacially cold distance between them. She spoke of his attention as merely flattering, and claimed she was a practical woman who saw his dukedom only as an opportunity to improve her family's destitute circumstances. She lied, stating that he was a means to an end and asking if he truly thought she could love a man who lived like a corpse, bound by duty and stripped of authentic feeling. When Caleb stood, his face draining of color as he begged her to tell him their kiss had meant something, Emily met his eyes and said it had meant nothing. She told him he was merely a duke who had paid her attention, and that no love had ever existed. She gestured toward the door, commanding him to return to London, marry Catherine, and fulfill the duty he was always meant for. Something behind Caleb's gray eyes died in that moment. The light extinguished as he accepted her words with a hollow, dead silence. He turned and left, his movements mechanical, his voice void of anger as he apologized for the intrusion. Emily stood frozen until the sound of his horse faded into the Bath evening before her legs gave out and she collapsed, weeping with a violent, silent grief for the man she had destroyed to save. Caleb returned to London a changed man, or rather, a man who had ceased to be human. He became an automaton, agreeing to the public wedding announcement and the immediate ceremony with the same detached efficiency he once applied to trade treaties. Geoffrey found him in his study days later, reviewing arrangements as if they were sterile data points, his voice emotionless as he claimed he had corrected his embarrassing lapse in judgment. He told his friend that he had mistaken gratitude for affection and manipulation for genuine feeling. He was dead inside, moving through the halls of Thornfield House like a ghost. Lady Catherine watched him with growing concern, noting that he looked like a man walking to his own execution. But Caleb simply replied that appearances were deceiving and continued his silent preparation for a loveless life of service. St. George's Chapel blazed with the cold, artificial fire of 1,000 candles, their light reflecting off the gilded walls and heavy crystal chandeliers that hung like frozen tears from the vaulted ceiling. The grandest wedding London had seen in decades was unfolding with the mechanical precision of a funeral. Caleb Winslow stood at the altar, a vision of ducal perfection in his full regalia, the Ravenswood ceremonial sword at his hip and family orders spanning his chest like a suit of armor designed to keep his soul from escaping. Every pew was filled with the glittering elite of the ton, dukes, earls, and viscounts who had come to witness the restoration of the Iron Duke. Inside, Caleb felt a hollow silence so profound that it muffled the swell of the organ music, a static white noise that drowned out the world he was expected to uphold. He watched as Lady Catherine Ashford walked down the aisle on her father's arm, a masterpiece of exquisite lace and seed pearls. She was beautiful, dignified, and exactly what the crown demanded. A duchess to sit beside a machine. At the place of honor, the king sat with shrewd, unblinking eyes, watching the performance he had commanded to secure the loyalty of his most indispensable servant. Beside Caleb, Geoffrey stood as witness, his face a neutral mask that betrayed none of the desperate investigation he had concluded only hours prior. Caleb's gaze drifted for a split second to Lord Petton, who sat under guard but wore a thin, satisfied smile, savoring what he believed was his ultimate victory over the man who had dared to feel. The Archbishop of Canterbury's voice resonated through the chapel, grounding Caleb in the terrifying finality of the moment. As Catherine reached the altar, she leaned in, her whisper intended only for Caleb's ears, offering him a final, silent permission. "You don't have to do this." Caleb met her blue eyes and saw not a bride, but a mirror of his own imprisonment. He whispered his apology to her, realizing she had known his heart was never in this arrangement. The Archbishop reached the invocation, calling upon anyone present to speak of a lawful impediment to the joining of these two souls. The silence that followed was a physical weight, stretching until Caleb's hand began to tremble against the hilt of his sword. In that silence, the competing voices of his life warred for dominance. He heard his father's ghost demanding that the Ravenswood name serve the crown above all else. He heard his own voice echoing in the council chambers, declaring that the crown was all that mattered. But cutting through the iron and the shadow came Emily's voice from the garden, soft and clear, asking if duty was truly enough to live for. He realized then that Geoffrey's revelation was true, that the king had given him a choice he had been too afraid to take, and that Emily's cruel rejection had been a final, desperate act of sacrifice to keep him from the ruin he was now standing in. "I cannot," Caleb said, his voice carrying with a terrifying clarity that silenced the organ and the breath of the congregation. A ripple of gasps swept through the pews like a violent wind. He turned to the shocked Archbishop and the apoplectic Lord Ashford, his movements no longer mechanical but driven by a sudden, violent clarity. He faced Catherine and told her she deserved a man whose whole heart was hers, a gift he could not give because his heart was elsewhere. She pressed his hand, an extraordinary act of grace that offered him the final courage to break his chains. Caleb removed his ducal ring, the symbol of 200 years of cold, inherited purpose, and placed it on the altar, surrendering the crown for the mercy he had found in the garden. He addressed the room, his voice ringing with the truth he had suppressed for 14 hollow years. He declared that a life lived without love was not service, but imprisonment, and that a man who could not be authentic could never truly serve the crown. He looked directly at the king, thanking him for the wisdom of the choice he had finally summoned the strength to make. Then, turning his back on the fury of Lord Ashford and the stunned silence of the ton, Caleb descended from the altar. He walked down the aisle past his rivals and his peers, his spine straight not from duty, but from a freedom that made him feel as though he were walking through sunlight for the first time. Geoffrey joined him halfway down the aisle, a witness not to a wedding, but to a resurrection. They left the chapel and mounted the horses Caleb had prepared, riding at breakneck speed away from the gilded cage of London and toward the honey-colored stone of Bath. He rode like a man possessed, shouting over the thunder of hooves, terrified that he was too late, that Emily would vanish before he could tell her he had seen through her beautiful, cruel lie. Dawn was breaking over the Haraway garden when he vaulted the gate, still dressed in his wedding clothes but stripped of the ducal weight that had defined him. He found Emily standing among the roses, her traveling trunk packed, ready to disappear to protect the man she thought she had saved. She turned to him, her face a mask of shock and tears as Caleb fell to his knees in the wet grass, morning dew soaking his fine silk. He told her the wedding was gone, that he had stood before the king and refused the masquerade because her smile had given her away. He looked at her and saw the truth she had tried to blink back, that she had destroyed herself to set him free. He told her he had given up the crown and the position not for her, but because none of it meant anything if he were a ghost living in its shadow. Emily's resolve shattered, and she collapsed into his arms, weeping as she admitted she had only lied to save him from the ruin he had just embraced. Caleb held her among the roses and realized he had not chosen ruin. He had chosen a legacy that was finally his own. He stood up straight, not as the Duke of Thornfield, but as a man who had finally earned his life. The end.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.